In the heart of British Columbia, a wedding turns to whispers as a mysterious girl arrives, holding a secret that shatters the lives of everyone there. What was meant to be a celebration of love becomes an unraveling of buried pain and unexpected ties that not even the bride could have foreseen. This story will pull you into a world of heartbreak, loyalty, and fierce resolve. Subscribe now to follow every twist as we unfold this unforgettable tale. It was a day touched by magic. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall stained glass windows of a small, time-worn church, bathing everything inside in a soft, golden glow. The gentle hum of hushed voices floated in the air, blending with the organ's hopeful tune as friends and family gathered to celebrate the wedding of Nora and Alex. It was a day they'd waited so long for, a day filled with joy, love, and the promise of new beginnings. But just as Nora lifted her bouquet and glanced at Alex, she felt something strange ripple through the room, as though some unseen shadow had slipped through the doors and settled among the guests. Then, suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church creaked open, and in walked a girl no older than 7. Her dress was worn, her hair tangled, and in her arms, she held a bundle wrapped in a tattered, faded blanket. Every head turned, every voice fell silent. The girl's gaze swept over the crowd, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. She looked as if she'd walked through miles of hardship just to reach this very spot. Nora's heart clenched, though she didn't yet understand why. She released Alex's hand, taking an unsteady step forward, her eyes fixed on the girl who now seemed too afraid to take another step. The little one took a trembling breath, then lifted her face and spoke with a voice that held the weight of worlds. "My name is Lily," she said, looking straight at Nora, her lips quivering. "My mother, she left me, she told me to take care of him." She looked down at the tiny face peeking from the blanket, the baby shifting restlessly in her arms. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as everyone struggled to make sense of what they were seeing and hearing. But for Nora, those words, "she left me," pierced her heart like a dagger. She had been that little girl once, left behind with no one to hold her, no one to tell her it would be all right. Her memories of childhood flooded her, memories she had long buried. She knew the terror of abandonment, the emptiness it left in a child's heart. Taking a deep breath, she closed the distance between them, her hands trembling as she reached out toward Lily. "Sweetheart, where is your mother?" she asked, her voice tender but unsteady. Lily's tear-filled eyes met hers, and she shook her head. I don't know. She told me to wait by the road, but she never came back." Her voice broke, and she clutched the baby closer, as though afraid he, too, might disappear. Nora felt a surge of protectiveness rising in her chest. She glanced at Alex, who stood frozen, his face pale with confusion and disbelief. Then, just as she was about to take the baby from Lily's arms, her gaze fell upon the baby's face, a face so familiar it took her breath away. The child's eyes, the shape of his nose, the dark, curling hair, they mirrored someone she had lost long ago. The room spun as realization crashed over her. This was her nephew. Her brother's child. The brother she had lost in a tragic accident years ago, the brother whose memory still haunted her every quiet moment. Her breath caught, and she staggered back, her world tilting on its axis. How could this be? The crowd in the church whispered in disbelief, but all Nora could see was the face of her lost brother reflected in the eyes of this fragile child. 1,000 questions filled her mind, but none louder than the overpowering instinct to protect, to shelter these children as she had longed to be sheltered herself. Finally, she tore her gaze away from the child and looked at Alex, her heart breaking as she saw the confusion and growing distance in his eyes. In that moment, she realized something painful and irrevocable. She could not go through with this wedding, not now, not with 2 abandoned lives depending on her. The weight of the decision settled over her, heavy as stone, and she turned toward the altar, her voice barely a whisper. I can't," she murmured, her words stumbling from her lips. Her mother, standing in the front pew, let out a gasp of shock and dismay, while Alex's face crumpled, the betrayal stark and raw. He took a step back, and though his lips moved as if to speak, no words came. His eyes, so full of love only moments ago, now held a wound that cut deeply into her soul. I have to take care of them," Nora said, her voice trembling but resolute as she knelt beside Lily, wrapping her arms around the frightened girl and the baby. Her heart thundered, the weight of her choice pressing heavily on her chest. She looked up at Alex one last time, an unspoken apology filling her eyes. In that moment, she knew her life would never be the same. Nora's decision to abandon her wedding reverberated like an earthquake through her life and the small community around her. The guests, stunned into silence by her sudden departure, filtered out of the church with looks of shock and whispers of betrayal, casting judgment in every sideward glance. Alex had left in silence, his eyes hollow with pain and disbelief, and the sound of his retreating footsteps felt like nails being hammered into her heart. For the next few days, Nora poured her energy into caring for Lily and the baby, both of whom were shadows of lost security and tender dependence. Lily's wide, solemn eyes followed Nora everywhere, clinging close to her side as though afraid to disappear if Nora were to let go. And the baby, whose cries echoed through Nora's small, cluttered home, seemed to carry the weight of his tragic beginning in every tear. The three of them formed a fragile family, one held together by uncertainty and a strange, undeniable bond. When Nora finally turned to her family for help, hoping for even a shred of support, she was met with disappointment after bitter disappointment. Her mother, who had been her confidant and friend, listened with arms crossed, her face a mask of bitterness Nora had never seen before. "Do you realize what you've done?" her mother snapped, her voice biting and cold. "You humiliated us, Nora. Walked out on a man who loved you, embarrassed the family in front of the entire town. And for what? To take in someone else's children." She sneered, glancing disdainfully at the bundle of blankets where the baby slept, his tiny chest rising and falling softly. Nora's face fell, her heart sinking as she met her mother's hard stare. She had always been close to her mother, thought that even if she didn't understand, she would at least offer some comfort, some warmth. But standing there, feeling her mother's harsh words slam into her, she realized she was alone in a way she hadn't anticipated. "They aren't just someone else's children, Mom," Nora whispered, her voice barely steady. "They're family. He's my brother's son. And Lily, she needs us. If I don't help them, who will?" Her mother looked away, a faint look of disgust twisting her lips. "Family," she scoffed. "You're throwing away your life, Nora. Don't you understand that? You're nothing but a foolish girl who doesn't know when to let go." The words struck deep, and Nora swallowed back tears. She could hardly believe the coldness in her mother's voice, the lack of compassion. Taking a steadying breath, Nora straightened, trying to gather the remnants of her pride. She would do this alone if she had to. She would not turn her back on these children, she couldn't. But it didn't stop there. One by one, Nora went to friends, people she'd known since childhood, hoping to find even a sliver of understanding. But each door she knocked on seemed to close in her face, their faces reflecting the same disappointed expressions, the same judgmental frowns. "Why are you doing this, Nora?" her childhood friend Martha asked, her voice filled with a mix of frustration and pity. "You had a whole life ahead of you. Alex was a good man, a perfect match for you. And now, you're throwing it all away for strangers." "They're not strangers, Martha," Nora replied, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "They're my family. Lily is just a little girl, and no one should have to face the world alone like she has." Martha sighed, shaking her head. "Maybe you're just meant to be alone, Nora. You've always had this need to take on the world's problems. It's exhausting. And we can't keep holding you up if you're going to keep falling into these messes." Nora's heart clenched, the familiar ache of abandonment settling deep in her chest. She had always thought her friends would be there for her, that they would stand by her in the darkest times. But now, in her moment of need, they were turning their backs, dismissing her struggle as if it were nothing more than a foolish decision. That night, Nora lay awake, the house heavy with silence save for the soft breaths of the children sleeping nearby. Her mind raced, filled with doubts and the painful sting of rejection. The isolation wrapped around her like a cold shroud, suffocating in its intensity. She felt like a stranger in her own life, abandoned by those who had once been her foundation. She had no one to lean on, no hand to hold as she navigated the uncertain path she had chosen. As the darkness deepened around her, she felt a tiny hand reach for hers, and she looked down to see Lily, her big eyes filled with a quiet sadness that mirrored her own. Wordlessly, Nora gathered the girl in her arms, holding her close, the weight of their shared sorrow pressing into the silence. She had no words of comfort to offer, no promises of an easier tomorrow, but in that moment, their bond was sealed, forged in shared pain and the faint glimmer of hope. But as dawn approached, and the shadows stretched long across the empty floor, a flicker of doubt crept into Nora's heart. Was she really capable of taking on this responsibility alone? The weight of it all felt unbearable, and she feared she was crumbling beneath the pressure. In the early hours, just as exhaustion began to take hold, a letter arrived, slipped under the door. It was from Alex. The sight of the envelope made Nora's heart stutter. She stared at her name, written in Alex's familiar handwriting, her fingers tracing the soft indents of his pen strokes. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon, especially not after how things had ended between them at the church. Her hand trembled as she opened the envelope, and with a deep, steadying breath, she began to read. The letter was brief but held all the weight of his disappointment. He expressed his heartbreak and confusion, his sadness at seeing the life they had planned crumble away in a single, unimaginable moment. Yet, in a surprising turn, he ended the letter with a simple offer: "If you need help, I'll be here. You don't have to do this alone, Nora." His words filled her with an overwhelming mixture of hope and guilt. The part of her that longed for companionship, that ached to share this heavy burden, reached for Alex's promise. Despite everything, he hadn't completely turned away from her. Perhaps, she thought, he truly meant to help. She couldn't deny that the prospect of having someone by her side was both a comfort and a relief. 2 days later, Alex appeared at her door, his face shadowed with the traces of sorrow and hesitation. She ushered him into the small, cluttered living room, feeling the tension that had settled between them like an invisible wall. "I'm glad you came," Nora said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice carried a blend of vulnerability and hope, both emotions that felt dangerously close to the surface. Alex nodded, glancing briefly at Lily, who was playing quietly in the corner, her small hands carefully stacking wooden blocks. I didn't know what else to do, Nora. After everything that happened, I thought maybe I could help. If nothing else, maybe I can offer some stability for you and them." Nora felt the tears pricking at her eyes as she looked at him, sensing the distance that now lay between them. "I never wanted to hurt you, Alex," she whispered. "But when I saw those children, I couldn't turn away. I just couldn't." For the first time since the wedding, Alex's face softened, a flicker of understanding passing over his features. He nodded, letting out a sigh. "I can see that now," he replied. "But I also see how much you're carrying on your own. Let me help, Nora. You shouldn't have to do this alone." For the next few weeks, Alex became a steady presence in their lives. He helped with repairs around the house, took Lily to the park, and even held the baby when Nora was too exhausted to stand. For a brief, fleeting time, it seemed like they had found a rhythm, a way to coexist amid the broken pieces of their past. Slowly, Nora began to let her guard down, feeling the walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble. She allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have the family she'd always dreamed of, one built on love, support, and understanding. Alex's support gave her a sense of stability, and she clung to it, wanting so desperately to believe in a future together. But one evening, when she was putting the baby to sleep, she heard voices through the thin walls. Alex was on the phone, his voice low and urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone, the unmistakable edge in his voice, sent a cold shiver down her spine. A sense of dread washed over her, but she pushed it aside, convincing herself it was nothing, just nerves from the long day. However, in the days that followed, things began to change. Alex grew more distant, his once comforting presence now tinged with impatience and frustration. He stopped offering to help as much, spending less time with the children and more time pacing the small living room, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. Then, one rainy afternoon, the truth finally emerged. Nora was folding laundry in the kitchen when she overheard Alex talking in hushed, clipped tones on his phone. She paused, her hands stilling as she caught a few words that sent a chill through her. "I know, I'm trying, but she's more difficult than I thought. She's holding on to those kids like they're her last hope. If she just agreed to put them in care, this whole thing would be so much easier." Nora's heart stopped. Her blood ran cold as she realized the meaning of his words. She stepped back, unable to breathe, unable to comprehend the betrayal she had just uncovered. This wasn't a man who had come back to help her. This was a man who had come to manipulate her, to use her vulnerability for his own convenience. The words echoed in her mind, each one a fresh stab of betrayal. She felt her knees grow weak, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, struggling to make sense of what she had just heard. Alex, the man she had once thought would stand by her through anything, was trying to take everything she held dear and twist it into something he could control. The realization struck her like a thunderbolt, leaving her reeling. Nora stumbled into the room, her face pale as she stared at him, raw fury mixed with pain filling her eyes. "Alex," she choked out, her voice shaking. How could you? How could you betray me like this? Those children, they are my family." Caught off guard, Alex turned to face her, his expression slipping from surprise to a resigned frustration that only deepened her heartbreak. "Nora, you have to understand. I wanted to help, but I can't watch you destroy your life for a responsibility that isn't even yours. I thought if I could just help you see reason, you would let them go." Nora took a step back, the distance between them suddenly feeling like a chasm she could never cross. "See reason," she repeated, her voice rising with a mixture of disbelief and pain. "Those children are all I have left of my brother. I will never let them go. How could you think I would? You don't know me at all, Alex. You never did." He opened his mouth to argue, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "I don't want to hear it," she said, her voice steely with determination. "I can't trust you, Alex. Not after this. You've broken every promise you ever made to me, every vow you swore at that altar. I never thought you would be capable of something so cruel." Alex stood there, silent, watching as she cradled Lily protectively against her side, her expression a mask of strength that barely hid the devastation in her heart. Without another word, he left, the sound of the door closing behind him like a final, heavy blow. Nora sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around Lily, who clung to her as though sensing the weight of the betrayal. As the cold silence settled around them, Nora felt the hollow ache of abandonment once again, only this time, it felt final. She had trusted Alex, let him into her life when she was at her most vulnerable, and he had turned her pain into a weapon. As the shadows lengthened across the room, a new resolve began to harden within her. She would protect these children, no matter what. And she would do it alone, if she had to. In the fading light, Nora tightened her arms around Lily and the baby, silently vowing to keep them safe, even as another knock at the door shattered the fragile silence of their home. The knock echoed through the dim room, startling Nora and jarring her from her grief-stricken resolve. She looked down at Lily, who clung to her, tiny fingers clutching her arm, eyes wide with fear. It was as if they both understood, without words, that nothing good ever came from a knock at the door. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Nora rose to her feet, whispering reassuringly to Lily. She walked toward the door, nerves coiled tightly within her chest, and opened it slowly. Standing there was a man in a charcoal suit, an unfamiliar face wearing a grave, serious expression. His presence was heavy, his manner cold and formal. "Nora Bennett?" he asked, his voice as neutral and unfeeling as the sharp lines of his suit. "Yes." Nora answered, her voice guarded. The man gave a quick, somber nod. "My name is Mark Lawson. I'm with Child Protective Services." He paused, allowing the words to settle, each one feeling like a punch to her gut. "I understand you're caring for 2 young children, Lily and an infant." Nora felt her pulse quicken, the dread she had felt only moments before blossoming into full-blown panic. She nodded, though her voice barely held steady. "Yes, I am. They're my family. My brother's children." Mark nodded but showed no sign of understanding or compassion. "Ms. Bennett, we have received reports expressing concerns over the welfare of these children and your ability to provide for them adequately." Nora's face flushed. She could feel the heat of both shame and fury rising within her. Who would have filed such a report? Alex. Her mother. She struggled to maintain her composure as her mind raced, 1,000 thoughts clamoring to break through the rising panic. "I'm doing my best for them," she said, her voice thin but firm. "These children have no one else. I'm all they have. They're safe with me." Mark's gaze softened briefly, though his professional mask remained firmly in place. "Ms. Bennett, I understand this must be difficult, but we have to consider what's best for the children. The situation you're in, no stable income, little support, is far from ideal." Nora's heart sank. She had known the challenges she would face, but the words were devastating to hear. I can do better," she said, her voice breaking. "I just need time." Mark shook his head slightly, as though accustomed to hearing the same words from people in far more desperate situations. I'm here to conduct a temporary assessment, Ms. Bennett. We need to ensure the children are being cared for appropriately. I'd like to take a look around if you don't mind. Trembling, Nora stepped aside, feeling a hollow pit of dread forming in her stomach as he entered her small, worn-down home. Mark's eyes swept over the cracked paint, the tired furniture, the cluttered corners filled with clothes, toys, and half-folded laundry. Nora knew the place was clean, but it bore the unmistakable signs of someone who was struggling, of a life being lived on the edge. As he made his way through the house, Nora felt as though her very soul were being inspected, weighed, and judged. He moved from room to room, asking questions she wasn't prepared to answer: how she planned to support the children long-term, who would help her when times were hard, what her future plans were. Every answer she gave felt inadequate, and each time she spoke, she could feel the ground slipping further beneath her feet. When Mark finally turned back to her, his expression was unreadable. "Thank you for cooperating, Miss Bennett," he said, offering her a small, practiced smile. "We'll be in touch soon to discuss the next steps." With that, he turned and left, closing the door quietly behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nora felt as though she had been punched in the gut, her entire world teetering on the edge of something dark and unthinkable. A soft tug on her sleeve pulled her out of her thoughts. She looked down to see Lily's eyes, wide and full of fear. "Are they going to take us away?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Nora knelt down and took Lily's face in her hands, forcing herself to find strength even as her heart shattered. "No, sweetheart. I won't let that happen. I'm here, and I'll always be here. You're safe with me. No one's going to take you away." But the words felt hollow, even to her. She could feel the cracks widening in her resolve, her strength waning under the weight of everything she had taken on. With each passing day, she was becoming acutely aware of how ill-equipped she was to face this battle alone. No matter how much she loved Lily and the baby, love alone would not be enough to keep them together. The next few weeks were grueling. Nora scrambled to find work, taking on odd jobs wherever she could, cleaning houses, watching other people's children, running errands. She spent long hours working, her body aching and worn down, her nights filled with restless sleep as she tried to devise a plan to secure their future. But despite her efforts, the reality was harsh and unyielding. The money she made barely covered the essentials. Each bill that arrived in the mail felt like a hammer blow, a reminder of how close they were to losing everything. She'd look at Lily and the baby, guilt gnawing at her as she wondered if she was truly doing the right thing, or if her pride was the only thing keeping her in this fight. One evening, after a long day of scrubbing floors and washing clothes, Nora returned home to find a letter waiting for her in the mailbox. She recognized the logo on the envelope instantly: Child Protective Services. Hands shaking, she opened it and read the contents, her eyes scanning the lines with mounting horror. They were scheduling a follow-up visit to reassess the children's living conditions, and if improvements weren't evident, they would be forced to consider alternative arrangements. A choked sob escaped her lips, and she sank onto the worn-out couch, her mind racing with fear and desperation. The thought of losing Lily and the baby, of being separated from the only family she had left, was unbearable. She had come so far, sacrificed everything, and yet it still felt like she was on the brink of losing it all. But that was only the beginning. The very next day, as she was leaving for a cleaning job, she received a call. It was from her landlord. His tone was curt, and his words were blunt: he was increasing the rent on her already barely affordable apartment. The added expense would be more than she could manage. "Please, Mr. Holden," she pleaded, the desperation clear in her voice. "I have 2 children with me. I'm barely making ends meet as it is. I just need more time to figure things out." But Mr. Holden was unmoved. "I'm sorry, Nora, but I have other tenants who would pay more without hesitation. I can't afford to keep the rent low for just 1 unit. You have a month to decide if you can stay." Nora's shoulders slumped as she hung up the phone, despair and hopelessness crashing over her like a tidal wave. She looked at Lily, who sat quietly coloring at the small, wobbly table, her innocent face blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. She knew that in a month's time, she might lose the only home they had, and with it, any hope of keeping her family together. She glanced at the letter from CPS, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. As darkness settled over their small, fragile world, Nora held Lily and the baby close, whispering to them softly as if her words could ward off the impending loss. But deep down, she knew she was teetering on the edge, her strength stretched beyond what she could bear. In that moment, she felt utterly, devastatingly alone. And as the clock struck midnight, a new letter slid quietly under her door, its thick, formal seal indicating that the worst was yet to come. The thick envelope lay ominously on the floor, its edges sharp against the soft light of the early morning. Nora's heart pounded as she stared at it, half fearing what new calamity it might contain. Finally, she forced herself to bend down, pick it up, and open it. The words, stamped in cold, impersonal font, blurred as she read. Final notice of eviction. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor, the letter slipping from her fingers. She had 30 days to find somewhere else, 30 days to uproot herself and the children, 30 days to somehow scrape together a miracle. The weight of it pressed down on her, tightening her throat, choking her breath. She looked over at Lily and the baby, who were still asleep, their faces peaceful, unaware of the turmoil that had become their reality. That afternoon, she made phone call after phone call, desperate to find a solution. But everywhere she turned, she met closed doors, curt replies, and dismissive rejections. Her closest friends were still distant, family members had turned cold, and the few shelters she contacted were overcrowded, with waitlists that stretched for months. As hope began to dwindle, her phone rang. She glanced at the number, recognizing it as one she hadn't seen in years. Her pulse quickened as she answered, her voice shaky with a blend of apprehension and hope. "Hello. Nora, it's James," the voice on the other end replied, deep and familiar, stirring memories she hadn't touched in years. James had been a close friend in college, someone she had once trusted with her secrets, her dreams, and, if she were honest with herself, her heart. They had lost touch over the years, drifting apart as life took them in different directions. But here he was now, reaching out when she felt most alone. "I heard about what you're going through," he continued, his voice warm and reassuring. I can't stand to think of you struggling like this. Let me help you, Nora. I have a guest house I'm not using. It's small, but it's yours if you need it." Relief flooded her, and she could feel the tension in her shoulders begin to melt away. "James, I don't even know what to say," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me." He chuckled softly, the warmth of his laughter filling the quiet space. "You don't have to say anything. Just let me help. Pack what you need and come by tomorrow. I'll make sure everything is ready." The next day, Nora loaded her few belongings, her heart swelling with cautious optimism. James's guest house was simple but cozy, a quaint little cottage nestled behind his sprawling, beautifully maintained property. She had a moment to catch her breath, a place where she could see a semblance of hope for the children and herself. As she settled in, James became an unexpected source of comfort and companionship. He would bring them groceries, offer to watch the baby so she could get some sleep, and play with Lily, making her laugh in ways Nora hadn't seen in a long time. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again, that maybe, just maybe, she could finally build a life here. James had always been a kind and patient man, and Nora felt her heart warm as they shared quiet conversations on the porch in the evenings. He would tell stories of his travels, make her laugh with tales of his own misfortunes, and listen intently when she opened up about her struggles, her fears, and her dreams for the children. One night, as the moon cast a soft glow over the guest house, James turned to her, his gaze steady and gentle. "Nora," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "You don't have to go through this alone. I want you to know that I'm here for you, in any way you need." Nora's heart fluttered, and she found herself drawn to him, the warmth of his presence filling the empty spaces inside her. The feelings she had once buried stirred again, and she allowed herself, if only for a moment, to imagine a future with him by her side. A future where she wasn't alone, where her burdens were shared, and where the children could grow up surrounded by love. But as the days passed, she noticed subtle changes, small shifts in James's behavior that she couldn't ignore. He began making comments about her responsibility to the children, remarks that seemed harmless at first but grew more insistent. "Are you sure this is the best thing for you, Nora?" he would ask, his tone gentle but probing. "Maybe there's a better option for everyone involved." At first, she brushed it off, thinking he was only concerned, but as the weeks passed, his words became sharper, his patience thinner. One evening, as they sat together, James let out a heavy sigh, his frustration evident. "Nora, I don't think you're seeing things clearly. You're clinging to these children, holding on to a past that's only hurting you. Maybe it's time to let go." Nora felt a chill settle over her, her heart sinking as she processed his words. She pulled her hand from his, her fingers tingling with a strange mix of betrayal and hurt. "Let go," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "These children are all I have left of my family, James. They're not just something I can give up on." He looked at her, his face unreadable. "But you have a choice, Nora. You can choose a better life, one without all this struggle, without the constant weight of their needs. We could be together, build something new. You'd have the support you deserve." The room fell into a suffocating silence as she realized the implications of his words. He wasn't here to support her, to help her rebuild her life with Lily and the baby. He wanted her, but he didn't want them. Her throat tightened, and she forced herself to keep her voice steady, though her heart was breaking. "James," she said, her voice cold and trembling, "if you think I would ever abandon these children, then you don't know me at all." He sighed, his expression hardening. "I just want what's best for you, Nora. You deserve a life without all this suffering. But if you're determined to ruin your life for them, then I can't be a part of it." His words echoed in her ears, each one a brutal reminder of the reality she had tried so hard to escape. He hadn't come to offer her redemption or support, he had come to offer her an escape, a way to leave behind everything that mattered to her. Without another word, Nora rose, gathering her things, her heart a mixture of fury and sorrow. She packed their few belongings, holding back tears as she woke Lily and gently lifted the baby from his crib. She had thought James was her last hope, the one person who could understand her, but she had been wrong. She was alone again, but this time, she felt the finality of it. As she left the guest house and stepped into the chilly night air, she didn't look back. She held Lily's hand tightly, cradling the baby close as she walked through the darkness, her only company the echo of her footsteps and the sting of betrayal. By dawn, they had nowhere to go. She found herself on a bench in a small, empty park, the children curled beside her as she tried to keep them warm against the morning chill. Her strength was waning, her hope almost extinguished. She had trusted so deeply, only to be let down, once again, by those she had thought would stand by her. But as the first light of morning crept over the horizon, Lily looked up at her, her small voice breaking the silence. "Nora, where will we go now?" Nora looked down at the little girl, her heart breaking as she forced herself to smile. She didn't have an answer. And for the first time, she felt the crushing weight of defeat, realizing she might not be able to protect them after all. As the pale morning sun began to rise, casting a faint warmth over the small park bench where Nora and the children huddled, she felt an overwhelming weariness seep into her bones. She could feel Lily's tiny hand clutching hers, while the baby stirred restlessly in her arms, both of them depending on her for a future that seemed increasingly out of reach. With no money, no home, and no one left to turn to, the weight of her isolation pressed down on her until it was nearly unbearable. But as luck, or perhaps fate, would have it, she was about to encounter another face from her past. Later that morning, as she wandered aimlessly through the streets, her mind reeling with a plan to find some temporary shelter, a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Nora. Is that you?" She turned to see Liam, an old friend from her childhood who had moved away years before. They had grown up together, shared secrets and dreams beneath the wide Canadian skies, but life had pulled them in different directions, and she hadn't seen him in over a decade. Now here he was, looking at her with a mix of surprise and concern. "Liam," she managed, her voice cracking with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She watched his face change as he took in the sight of her disheveled clothes, the two children clinging to her, and the dark circles beneath her eyes. He approached slowly, his warm gaze scanning over her as he absorbed the enormity of her situation. "Nora, what happened to you?" Unable to hold back any longer, Nora felt a tear slip down her cheek, then another, until the words tumbled out of her. She told him everything, about losing her family, her brother's children, her sacrifices, and the heartbreaking betrayals she had endured. Through it all, Liam listened quietly, nodding and placing a comforting hand on her shoulder as she spoke. Finally, he said, "You don't have to go through this alone. Let me help. I have a place, a small house just a few minutes from here. It's not much, but you and the kids are welcome to stay as long as you need." Nora's breath caught. She felt a glimmer of hope in his words, the first she'd felt in weeks. "Oh, Liam, thank you. I don't even know what to say. It's been so hard." Her voice cracked as she tried to express her gratitude, feeling as if she'd been thrown a lifeline just before drowning. With gentle hands, Liam took her bags and led her and the children back to his house, a modest but tidy little place nestled on a quiet street. That evening, after helping her settle in, he prepared a simple meal for all of them, and Nora could see how Lily's face brightened as she watched Liam serve them. It was the first time in weeks that Lily seemed to relax, her small shoulders no longer hunched in worry, her laughter ringing through the house like a balm to Nora's weary soul. For the next few days, things felt almost normal, a hint of warmth creeping back into their lives. Liam played with Lily, rocking the baby to sleep when Nora's exhaustion took hold, and for a brief moment, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find some stability here. She felt herself beginning to trust again, to let go of the fears that had gripped her for so long. But the feeling was short-lived. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table after putting the children to bed, Liam's tone shifted, and the gentle kindness she had come to rely on took on a different edge. "Nora," he began carefully, though his eyes were no longer warm. "I've been thinking a lot about your situation. You know, raising these children, especially with the financial struggles you're facing, it just doesn't seem sustainable." Nora's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the warning signs, the subtle turn of a once kind voice into something more calculating. She tried to keep her expression neutral, though anxiety twisted in her stomach. "What are you saying, Liam?" He leaned forward, his gaze intent. "I'm saying, there are alternatives. Adoption, for example. You could find a family who would be able to provide the kind of stability you want for them, financially and emotionally. You'd be free to rebuild your life, find work, even go back to school if that's what you wanted. Don't you think it's time to start considering what's best for you, Nora?" His words cut through her, cold and sharp. She could hardly believe what she was hearing, and yet, a part of her had feared this very suggestion. She had opened her heart, placed her trust in him, and now he was asking her to consider abandoning the very children she had fought so hard to keep. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I can't. I won't. These children, they're all I have left of my family. I made a promise to them, to my brother, that I would protect them." Liam's expression hardened, his face taking on an air of exasperation. "But Nora, be reasonable. You're barely holding on as it is. Don't you see that this isn't just about you anymore? You're clinging to something that's dragging you down. They would be better off with someone who could actually provide for them." She felt her heart twist, her stomach clenching as the weight of his words settled over her. She had hoped he would understand, that he would support her decision, but it was clear that he, like so many others, believed she was being selfish, irrational. And yet, she couldn't let go. Her love for these children was boundless, fierce, and unyielding. How could anyone expect her to sever that bond, to walk away from the only family she had left? Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but her words held a strength she didn't know she had. "If you really cared, Liam, you would understand. I can't give them up. No matter how hard it is, I will find a way." Liam's face darkened, his patience thinning. "Fine, Nora. If that's the way you feel, then maybe it's time for you to find another place to stay. I offered you a way out, a chance to rebuild, and you're choosing to throw it all away. I can't keep supporting someone who won't even help herself." Nora's heart broke, piece by piece, as she realized he was serious. This was his ultimatum, his line drawn in the sand. She felt the familiar sting of betrayal, the hollow ache of being abandoned once again. She had trusted him, let herself hope that he would be different, that he would see the value in what she was fighting for. But as he walked away, leaving her standing in the small, dimly lit kitchen, she knew she was on her own once more. Later that night, she packed her bags in silence, moving slowly so as not to wake the children. Lily, sensing the tension, had fallen asleep curled up beside her, her small body seeking the comfort and warmth she so desperately needed. Nora looked down at her, stroking her hair softly, feeling her own heart break as she prepared to leave yet another place, yet another person who had let her down. As dawn approached, she gathered the children, holding Lily's hand tightly as they slipped quietly out of Liam's house. The cold morning air bit at her skin, and the weight of her exhaustion bore down on her like an unbearable burden. She was exhausted, broken, and beginning to lose hope. Each betrayal felt like another piece of her soul being chipped away, each rejection a reminder of how isolated she truly was. As they reached the edge of town, a fierce wind whipped around them, scattering dried leaves across the street. Nora felt her resolve weakening, felt the crushing weight of loneliness and despair closing in. She knelt down, pulling Lily close, wrapping the baby tightly in his blanket as she whispered soft promises to them both, though she wasn't sure she even believed them herself. But just as the last of her strength was slipping away, she saw the faint outline of a small, cozy cafe opening for the morning nearby. Desperate for warmth and a moment's respite, she led the children inside. They took a seat in a quiet corner, huddling together as she tried to gather her thoughts, to find some small thread of hope. As she sipped a cup of hot tea, her mind whirring with desperation, a warm hand gently touched her shoulder. She looked up, surprised to see the cafe's owner, an elderly woman with kind, knowing eyes, watching her with a soft smile. "You look like you could use a friend," the woman said kindly, her voice gentle and understanding. The warmth of the cafe seeped through Nora's cold, exhausted body, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and baked bread filled the air around her. She looked up at the cafe owner, a petite woman with silver hair tucked into a loose bun, her eyes softened by years of experience and quiet empathy. For a brief moment, Nora allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone. The woman introduced herself as Marie and pulled up a chair next to Nora, her movements slow and gentle. "I've seen that look before, dear," Marie said, her voice soothing. "Life's knocked you down, hasn't it?" Nora could only nod, the words caught in her throat. She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but the kindness in Marie's eyes broke down her defenses. Over the next few minutes, Nora found herself telling Marie about her struggles, her fears, the endless betrayals. Marie listened without interrupting, her gaze steady and unjudging, offering a quiet support Nora had longed for. Marie placed her hand over Nora's, giving it a light squeeze. "You have a strong heart, Nora," she said. "I can tell you're a fighter, even if you don't see it right now. I know you're exhausted, but you've made it this far. And sometimes, it's those with the hardest paths who end up finding the deepest strength." The warmth of Marie's words wrapped around her, and for the first time in a long while, Nora felt a glimmer of resilience stir inside her. She smiled gratefully, looking over at the children who were finally resting, their small faces peaceful as they leaned against each other in the booth. Marie's kindness felt like a lifeline, and Nora clung to it, allowing it to reignite the tiniest flicker of hope. By the end of the week, Marie had offered Nora a modest job helping out at the cafe, cleaning tables, restocking, washing dishes. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small step toward stability. With Marie's guidance, Nora found a tiny, single-room apartment just a block away. The place was cramped, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, but it was warm, and it was theirs. She moved in with the children, setting up a small crib in the corner for the baby, while Lily slept beside her on a narrow bed they shared. Determined to provide for the children, Nora threw herself into the work, taking on extra hours whenever she could, sometimes staying until midnight to clean the cafe top to bottom. She felt her strength returning in small ways, the satisfaction of each honest day's work filling her with purpose. She began budgeting every cent, using every spare dollar to buy small comforts for Lily and the baby, hoping to bring a semblance of normalcy to their lives. The weeks turned into months, and Nora's routine became her anchor. Slowly, she began to believe that maybe she could keep the children with her, that maybe she was capable of giving them the life they deserved. She envisioned a future, humble but filled with love, a future where they could finally feel safe. She clung to this vision, pouring every ounce of energy she had into making it real. But the world had other plans. One cold November evening, as she was closing up the cafe, a notice awaited her on the door, a sudden inspection from the city that would require costly repairs and upgrades to keep the cafe running. Marie's face fell as she read the notice, her eyes brimming with worry. "I don't know how I'll afford this, Nora," she admitted, her voice shaking. "The cafe is all I have, and I'm afraid this might be the end of it." Nora's heart clenched. She knew how much the cafe meant to Marie and how it had become a lifeline for her own family. The thought of losing it was unbearable. She watched Marie retreat to the back, her shoulders slumped, the years of hard work weighing heavily on her now frail frame. Nora stayed late into the night, cleaning and preparing for the inspection, scrubbing every surface until it shone, doing everything she could to help keep the cafe afloat. But the morning after the inspection, Marie's worst fears were confirmed. The repairs would be extensive and costly, and without a sudden infusion of money, the cafe would be forced to close within the month. Marie was heartbroken, and Nora felt as though her world was crumbling again. With no income, her savings already dwindling, and the cost of raising 2 children looming over her, Nora faced the grim reality of their situation once more. As she sat alone in the small apartment that night, Lily nestled beside her, the baby cooing softly in her arms. She could feel the walls closing in. That evening, after putting the children to bed, Nora lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, her mind racing with impossible solutions. She could feel herself unraveling, the years of strain and rejection, the crushing weight of constant survival scraping away at her remaining strength. She was desperate, exhausted, and filled with the gnawing fear that she was on the edge of losing everything once again. Determined not to give up, she applied for every job she could think of, knocking on doors, visiting shops, and calling old contacts. She worked late nights wherever she could, taking on cleaning and temporary shifts at nearby restaurants, pushing her body to its limits. But her income wasn't enough to keep them afloat. The rent piled up, bills went unpaid, and soon she was faced with eviction notices once more. Her final attempt at strength came in the form of a meeting at the local church. Desperate for support, she turned to the pastor, hoping that maybe the church could offer her some temporary assistance. She arrived early, sitting quietly in a pew, her hands clasped tightly as she prayed, pouring out every last shred of hope she had left. The pastor, a kind man with gentle eyes, listened to her story with quiet sympathy. But his response, though sympathetic, was practical. "I wish I could help more, Nora," he said, his voice low with regret. "But we're stretched thin as it is, with so many others in need. I can offer you a food voucher, maybe some clothes, but beyond that," his voice trailed off, and Nora could see the pity in his eyes. A wave of shame and despair washed over her as she left the church, the meager offering clutched in her hand, her last attempt at reaching out met with little more than fleeting charity. She walked back to the apartment, her steps heavy with the crushing knowledge that she had, once again, come to the end of her options. She had tried everything, she had given all she had, poured her soul into every effort, and it still wasn't enough. As she entered the apartment, she found Lily waiting for her by the door, her small, sleepy face creased with worry. "Are we going to be okay, Nora?" Lily asked softly, her wide eyes full of innocent trust. Nora knelt down, pulling her into a tight embrace, the warmth of the little girl's arms grounding her for a moment. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice steady even as her heart broke. "We're going to be okay. I'll find a way. I promise." But as she lay in bed that night, the reality sank in like a lead weight. She had run out of strength, out of resources, and out of time. In the stillness of the night, with the children sleeping peacefully beside her, she felt her spirit shatter, the last of her resolve crumbling under the relentless weight of her struggle. And as dawn broke, the smallest glimmer of light filtered through the cracked window, casting a soft glow over the children's faces. For the first time, she felt utterly defeated, an emptiness settling in her chest. She had fought so hard, clung to hope with every ounce of strength, but the world had broken her down, leaving nothing but exhaustion and quiet despair in its wake. The morning after her last sleepless night, Nora moved in a fog of exhaustion, her mind numb, her body weakened. The days had blurred together into a gray haze of worry, sacrifice, and heartbreak. She forced herself through each task with Lily by her side, the baby cradled close, doing her best to shield the children from her despair. But with each passing day, her strength waned. It was during one of those bleak afternoons, when the sky was covered in thick, cold clouds, that a knock at the door startled her. Her landlord, Mr. Grant, stood there with a look that twisted her stomach. Nora braced herself, hoping against hope that it wasn't another eviction notice, though she knew it was inevitable. But the words that came next struck her far deeper than any eviction notice could. "Nora," he began, his voice cautious. "I thought I should be the one to tell you. I spoke with your mother yesterday. She came by the office with some unsettling concerns about your living situation here." Nora's heart pounded. Her mother had never approved of her decision to take in the children, but she hadn't imagined it would go this far. "My mother?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Why would she? What did she say?" Mr. Grant sighed, glancing down at his feet, as though unable to meet her gaze. "She claimed that it's not safe for the children here. She said you've been struggling to make rent, and she questioned whether you could provide a stable home for them." His voice dropped to a near whisper. She mentioned the option of alternative care, perhaps adoption. The world seemed to tilt beneath her. Her mother, the woman she had once thought would stand by her, had gone behind her back, trying to push the children away from her. Rage and betrayal burned within her, but she forced herself to keep her composure. She could feel Mr. Grant's pitying eyes on her, and the last thing she wanted was to show him how deeply her mother's actions had cut her. "Thank you for letting me know," she managed, her voice thick with barely concealed anger. She closed the door, leaning against it, her breathing ragged. She knew her mother didn't approve of her choices, but to try and undermine her like this, to reach out to the landlord with suggestions of adoption, was more than she could bear. As she struggled to regain control, the phone rang, the shrill sound slicing through the silence. She picked it up, her voice wavering as she answered. "Nora." Her mother's voice, sharp and unapologetic, came through the line. "I just spoke with Mr. Grant. I know he's told you what I said." Nora gripped the phone tighter, her fingers digging into the plastic. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why would you do that? You know how much those children mean to me. You know what I've sacrificed for them." Her mother's sigh was cold, unyielding. "You're sacrificing too much, Nora. You've let your life fall apart over them. I don't see my daughter in the woman you've become, a woman hanging on by a thread, losing everything because of a misplaced sense of responsibility." "A misplaced sense of responsibility?" Nora repeated, her voice rising with incredulity. "They're family, Mom. They're my family. And you'd rather see them in the care of strangers than with me. They deserve stability," her mother said firmly. "And you deserve a life, Nora. You could start fresh, find happiness again if you'd let go." Tears streamed down Nora's cheeks as her mother's words sank in. "How could you? How could you betray me like this?" Her mother's voice softened slightly, though her tone remained resolute. "Someday, you'll understand, Nora. Sometimes love requires hard decisions." With that, the line went dead, leaving Nora standing alone in the dim, quiet apartment, the weight of her mother's words pressing down on her like an anchor. She wanted to scream, to cry out in frustration, but the sight of Lily and the baby sleeping peacefully on the bed stopped her. She couldn't fall apart, not in front of them. She had to keep going, even if it felt as though her very foundation was crumbling. As the days passed, she felt the effects of her mother's interference in every small interaction. Neighbors avoided her gaze, whispers followed her as she walked through town, and doors she had once felt welcome at were now closed to her. It was as if her entire world had conspired to isolate her, to force her into a corner where the only choice would be to let the children go. But despite the mounting pressure, she clung to them fiercely, refusing to give in. Then, just when she thought things couldn't get worse, she received a call from Child Protective Services. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Mrs. Collins, her tone businesslike and devoid of warmth. "Ms. Bennett, I've received multiple concerns about your ability to care for Lily and the infant. We'll need to conduct an in-person assessment. I'll be stopping by your residence tomorrow morning." Nora's stomach twisted, and panic welled up within her. She couldn't let them take the children, couldn't let this be the end of everything she had fought so hard to protect. "Please, Mrs. Collins," she pleaded, "I'm doing everything I can. They're safe with me. I'm all they have left." But Mrs. Collins was unmoved. "We'll discuss everything at the visit, Ms. Bennett. Until then, please prepare any documentation you may have regarding your income, housing stability, and ability to provide for the children." The line went dead, and Nora stood in the quiet apartment, the weight of impending loss crushing her. The walls seemed to close in, the small room feeling more like a cage than a home. She looked over at Lily, who sat quietly with her coloring book, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding around her. That night, Nora lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing with anxiety. Her mother's betrayal, the whispers of the community, the looming visit from CPS, it all felt like an inescapable trap, a carefully orchestrated plan to tear her family apart. She clutched the baby close, her other arm wrapped protectively around Lily, as though holding them tightly enough might somehow shield them from the forces closing in. When morning finally came, Nora moved numbly through her routine, her body heavy with dread. She cleaned the small apartment until it sparkled, made sure the children were dressed neatly, and gathered every piece of paperwork she could think of. By the time Mrs. Collins arrived, she was a bundle of nerves, her hands trembling as she opened the door. Mrs. Collins stepped in, her eyes scanning the room with a cold, assessing gaze. She walked through the apartment, taking notes, her expression impassive as she looked over the modest furnishings and the carefully organized piles of toys and clothes. She asked Nora question after question, about her income, her job search, her support system, each question laced with a subtle doubt that made Nora's heart sink lower with every answer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Collins closed her notebook, looking at Nora with a stony expression. "Ms. Bennett, I can see that you're doing your best, but we're concerned about the long-term stability of this environment. We'll be reviewing your case carefully and discussing options for the children's welfare." Nora's throat tightened, the words she had dreaded hanging in the air. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They're all I have left. I promised my brother I would protect them. I love them like they're my own." Mrs. Collins's face softened slightly, but she remained resolute. "Love is important, Miss Bennett, but so is stability. We'll be in touch." And with that, she left, closing the door quietly behind her. Nora collapsed onto the couch, her hands covering her face as silent tears slipped down her cheeks. She had tried so hard, sacrificed everything, and yet it still wasn't enough. Her own mother had betrayed her, her friends had abandoned her, and now, even the system seemed determined to tear her family apart. As the evening settled over the small apartment, Lily climbed onto the couch beside her, wrapping her arms around Nora in a gentle hug. "It's okay, Nora," she whispered, her voice full of childlike faith. "We'll be okay. We have each other." Nora held her tightly, the simple words both a comfort and a heart-wrenching reminder of what she stood to lose. She looked down at Lily's trusting face, her heart breaking all over again as she silently vowed to keep fighting, no matter the cost. But deep down, in the quietest corners of her heart, she feared that the battle was already lost. Days passed in a daze of dread and uncertainty. Nora clung to the children, even as the weight of CPS's looming decision hung over her like a storm cloud. Every knock on the door, every unexpected sound outside made her heart lurch, terrified it would be the moment they came to take Lily and the baby away. She spent her days filling out applications for any work she could find, though each passing rejection chipped away at her remaining strength. She had poured every ounce of her being into protecting these children, and still, it felt as though everything she did wasn't enough. And then, one late afternoon, as she went through an old box of family documents in a final attempt to gather anything that might help her case, she stumbled across an envelope she'd never seen before. It was sealed and bore her father's handwriting, letters she recognized instantly. A pang of longing rippled through her chest. Her father had passed when she was young, and while her memories of him were faint, they were colored by kindness and warmth. With trembling fingers, she opened the letter, a strange sense of foreboding tightening in her chest. Inside, her father's handwriting covered the page, each line a delicate scrawl of words that spoke of love, loss, and something darker, a truth that had been hidden from her for her entire life. The letter was addressed to her mother, written just before her father's passing. As she read, her heart sank, each word a blow that left her breathless. Her father's letter spoke of her mother's insistence on hiding family secrets, money, connections, and inheritances that had been quietly concealed, leaving Nora in the dark her whole life. It seemed that her family had once been well off, but her mother, for reasons her father didn't fully explain, had cut herself, and, by extension, Nora, off from those resources. One line, in particular, stole the breath from her lungs. "If anything happens to me, remember that Nora deserves to know the truth about her past and her family's legacy. She deserves a life free of struggle, a life where she can build her own family, not chained by secrets or shame." Nora felt her hands shake, her mind reeling with the implications. Her mother had deliberately kept this hidden from her, burying her in hardship while hoarding the resources that could have saved her from years of heartache. Every struggle, every sacrifice she'd made flashed before her eyes, and the bitterness of betrayal settled heavily in her heart. With renewed determination, she grabbed the letter, clutching it like a lifeline, and headed toward her mother's home. The betrayal was like fire in her veins, and the need for answers, finally, for honesty, propelled her forward, filling her with a strength she hadn't felt in months. When her mother opened the door, Nora didn't wait to be invited inside. She stepped over the threshold, her eyes fierce with an anger that silenced the words forming on her mother's lips. "Why did you lie to me?" Nora demanded, her voice shaking. She held up the letter, her fingers tightening around it until her knuckles turned white. "Why did you hide this from me?" Her mother's face paled, and she reached for the letter, but Nora pulled it away, her eyes flashing with a mix of hurt and fury. "I struggled for years, Mom. I lost everything, sacrificed every piece of myself to care for those kids. And you had the means to help, to make sure I didn't have to fight this hard. But you chose to let me suffer." Her mother's mouth opened and closed, the weight of Nora's words hanging in the air. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and unsteady. I thought it was best this way. I didn't want you growing up expecting handouts. I wanted you to learn independence, to build a life on your own terms." Nora's heart twisted, her mother's words twisting the knife deeper. "So you wanted me to learn independence, at the cost of my own family?" "I wasn't asking for handouts. I just wanted to protect the only family I have left. You knew what I was going through, how close I am to losing these children, and you did nothing." Her mother's eyes filled with a complicated mix of regret and defiance. "Nora, sometimes love requires difficult choices. I only wanted you to be strong enough to handle the world on your own." Nora's voice dropped to a whisper, barely holding back tears. "Strength is not forcing someone to suffer alone. You took my future, my stability, my chance at happiness, and hid it from me. You let me break myself down while you watched." There was nothing more to say. Nora felt hollow, emptied out by the last of her mother's betrayals. She turned and walked out, clutching the letter tightly in her hand, her only connection to the truth of a family legacy she had never known. Returning home, Nora was greeted by Lily, who ran to her with open arms. The sight of the little girl's trusting face, her eyes filled with pure, untainted love, gave Nora a final surge of determination. She would use every last shred of her strength to fight for these children. They were her family, the only real family she had. With the inheritance her mother had hidden from her, Nora immediately contacted a lawyer to help her secure the financial stability she needed to keep the children. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to secure a safe, stable home and provide a future where they could finally be free of fear and uncertainty. The night before her final court meeting with CPS, she sat with Lily and the baby, holding them close as she whispered promises of a life filled with warmth, security, and love. The following morning, Nora faced the CPS representatives with renewed confidence. She showed them proof of her inheritance, explained the stability it would provide, and with a steady voice, made it clear that she was prepared to offer these children everything they needed and more. In the end, CPS granted her custody. She held the children close as tears of relief streamed down her cheeks. They were hers, and no one would take them away. She had weathered every betrayal, endured every hardship, and now, as she looked at the faces of the children she loved more than anything in the world, she knew her battle had been worth every painful step. She had finally found her redemption. The first morning after the custody decision felt like a new dawn in Nora's life. Sunlight streamed through the windows of their small apartment, casting a warm glow across the room where Lily played with the baby, her laughter echoing softly, filling the space with a joy Nora hadn't felt in years. The heavy weight of fear that had followed her every step seemed to melt away as she watched them, realizing with a quiet certainty that they were safe. They were finally, truly home. Nora had secured a modest home with her inheritance, a small, cozy house with a fenced backyard where the children could play freely, a place filled with light and warmth. She had done it. Against all odds, she had kept her promise to her brother, and she had created a home for his children, a place where they would know only love, security, and the freedom to grow without fear. And, in many ways, she had found a home for herself, too. Moving day arrived on a chilly but bright morning. Friends from the cafe, neighbors who had once distanced themselves but now seemed to recognize her resilience, and even Marie, the cafe owner who had taken her in during the darkest of times, showed up to help. Boxes were passed, laughter was shared, and for the first time, Nora felt truly supported, surrounded by a community that had finally embraced her courage. Marie caught her arm as they moved a box into the new living room, her eyes warm with pride. "I always knew you were meant for something more than hardship, Nora. You've got a strength most people could never even dream of. And look," she gestured toward Lily and the baby, who were playing with their new toys on the floor, "you gave them a future." Nora's eyes misted with tears, and she hugged Marie tightly. "Thank you, Marie. You were there when I thought I couldn't go on. I'll never forget it." As the day wore on, the house filled with the aroma of fresh-baked cookies Marie had brought over, the laughter of old friends, and the soft hum of hope that had finally taken root in Nora's heart. She marveled at the home she had created, a small but sturdy haven, built on a foundation of her love, resilience, and sacrifice. That evening, after everyone had left, Nora tucked Lily and the baby into bed, smoothing back their hair and watching their peaceful faces as they drifted into sleep. She knelt beside Lily, who opened her eyes briefly and whispered, "Are we really staying here forever, Nora?" Nora smiled, brushing a stray curl from Lily's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. We're staying. This is our home, and no one will take it from us." The peace in Lily's face as she drifted back to sleep filled Nora with a profound sense of fulfillment. She kissed both children goodnight and retreated to the small living room, where she sat quietly by the window, looking out at the clear, star-filled sky. In that stillness, Nora allowed herself to reflect on everything she had endured, the betrayals, the relentless struggles, the nights spent in fear and uncertainty. She had fought through every obstacle, and while the pain had been immense, she realized that each moment had shaped her, transforming her into someone stronger than she'd ever known herself to be. She was no longer the woman who doubted her worth, who questioned her ability to protect those she loved. She had discovered a strength, a resilience that would carry her and her family forward into a future filled with hope. As she sat by the window, Marie's words echoed in her mind, "You've got a strength most people could never even dream of." She finally believed it. Her path had been a difficult one, but it had led her here, to this home filled with love, where she was surrounded by the family she had chosen to fight for. In the quiet of the night, a feeling of warmth and gratitude washed over her. She felt her father's presence, a comforting reminder of the family legacy she had reclaimed, the love that had guided her through every painful step. She knew he would be proud of her, proud of the woman she had become, and the family she had protected against all odds. The weeks turned into months, and life settled into a steady, joyful rhythm. Nora found work at a nearby school, helping in the library, where she spent her days surrounded by books and learning, something she had always loved. The steady income, though modest, was enough to keep them comfortable, and every evening, she would return to the home she had fought so hard to create, greeted by the sound of Lily's laughter and the baby's delighted squeals. Her mother eventually reached out, her tone softened with regret. They met for coffee in a small cafe, where her mother offered an apology that, while late, seemed genuine. "I thought I was helping," her mother had whispered, tears in her eyes. "I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I see now that I was wrong." Nora felt a strange mix of forgiveness and sadness as she listened, understanding that, while her mother's actions had caused her pain, they had also taught her what true resilience looked like. She accepted the apology, knowing she no longer needed anyone else's validation or support to feel whole. She had found that strength within herself, a strength that was enough. On one particular summer evening, as the family sat outside, watching fireflies flicker in the twilight, Nora felt a sense of peace that she had never known. The children played nearby, their laughter filling the air, and she leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes, allowing herself to bask in the life she had created, a life born of struggle, but filled with a depth of love and contentment that few ever find. In that moment, she knew that every hardship, every heartbreak, had been worth it. She had given Lily and the baby a future, a safe place where they would grow up surrounded by warmth, laughter, and the unwavering love of a mother who had fought for them with every fiber of her being. Her journey had brought her to this place of healing, of newfound strength, and of endless possibility. And as the stars shone brightly overhead, Nora smiled, knowing that they were finally, truly home.